Today I stand before you all as the youngest person to be released from a California state prison with a death sentence. A sentence that was imposed on me when I was an abused foster child. The way in which that sentence came my way is, first I'd have to backtrack my life before I ever got that sentence. I was placed into the foster care system at 17 months old. It was told to me that my mother was mentally ill and that she was not able to take care of me or my younger brother. By the time of my incarceration, I had experienced multiple abusive foster homes. The abuse was horrific. It was the type of abuse that no one should experience, not even an animal. I was physically assaulted. I was emotionally abused. I wasn't fed. I was locked in closets. And I was told that I was nothing. I was treated as though I was nothing. At the age of 6, my foster mother's oldest son began to abuse me. It first started with physical abuse, where he would punch me and kick me and berate me. And then one night, after he was placed in my room, he sexually assaulted me. He broke something in me. He broke my innocence. He stripped me of my self-love, of my care. I ran away. That was my first interaction with law enforcement. I ran away at the age of 6. I was running away from my abusive foster home. The authorities were called. And when the authorities captured me, he hit me over the top of my head with a flashlight. He did a Superman dive on me. That's how he got a hold of me, because I was running away. And he put me into the back of the police car and took me to juvenile hall. Again, that was my very first charge. I was charged as a runaway. I now didn't trust adults. I now could no longer trust authorities. I only had myself and my younger brother and my thoughts to kind of figure out where to go, what to do. I was again placed back in the same foster home after I was released from juvenile hall, which I ran away again, and that started a series of how I started to process my anger, my hurt, my pain. I became a runaway. From running away to still inside my home to lying, I took all of those characteristics out into our society. It started from breaking inside the kitchen cabinets inside my foster home. She put locks on the kitchen cabinets. She put locks on the refrigerator. She sectioned off a 10-bedroom home and created the side. That's what we called it. It was that side, because that's where the foster children lived. She had over 100 foster children in this home of hers. Again, those characteristics I took out into the street, and I started to steal from grocery stores. I started to break in homes. I started to break in cars. I started to become destructive. I was the kid that broke things. And it seemed like for no reason, but I broke things to release the frustration and the anger and the confusion that resided inside of me. It's what made me feel better, because everything else inside of me was broken. I was now put in multiple programs throughout the county. And that documentation was that I was a troubled youth, a troubled foster youth. So now the record has now been established. So now whenever someone attends to me, assesses me, they now go off that record for me being a runaway, for me being destructive, for me being a thief, for me burglarizing school lockers to steal food. This was how my interactions with law enforcement started. I continued to run away from multiple homes. I could only keep track of my life by the schools in which I went to, because I was always going to another school. It was always so unstable. I couldn't develop friendships because I couldn't stay in a place long enough. But I also had emotional issues because I didn't trust people. I now decided I was going to stand up for myself. So I now packed the biggest bag that I could ever pack, and I ran away. Well, this time when I ran away to my second abuser's home. This was someone who I met while riding bikes in my neighborhood. This was someone who befriended me. This was an older gentleman who lived right around the corner from my foster home. He became a friend, a confidant, as well as someone who I viewed as like a father figure because I didn't have one. So when I ended up meeting my second abuser, after he befriended me and became my confidant, he became someone that I loved, that I looked up to. He taught me things. He groomed me. He was the only person that ever made me a promise. I didn't have parents to make me promises of being there or returning. So when he made those promises, I was like, about time somebody cares about me. About time somebody values me to even want to promise me anything. So I held on to those promises. And he told me that he would always be there. So when I ran away, that's another reason why I was running away, because I now had someone. I ended up running away to his home. It was in the middle of the night. I snuck into his garage. And I was actually going through his refrigerator. I was trying to make some food. He heard me, came out there, and asked me what I was doing. And I shared with him what had taken place. He ushered me back into his home. And he made me a sandwich. And we talked. And he said that I could stay there the night. This was one of the worst nights of my life. He took all the love and care and happiness that he provided. He flipped it. He turned it on me. The love and care became shame and pain and embarrassment when he took my love for him and turned it into hate. I then learned that my younger brother had also been abused by him. This was probably the heaviest thing that I had to bear, because my brother only knew of him because of me. So when I learned that he was also abused by both of my abusers, but mainly the second one, that was what like hurt me the most, because I really felt responsible. It was so destructive that I ultimately took my second abuser's life. One of the worst acts of my life is something that I can't take back. It's something that I will live with for the rest of my life. After getting arrested, going through trial, and being handed a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years, they sent me off to a maximum security prison. Throughout my time in prison, I realized that an abuser doesn't just wake up and become an abuser. Something happens. I realized that I was the person that furthered the cycle of violence. It was through my rehabilitative therapy that I started to understand how we work as human beings. That's when I incorporated education, therapy, and positive coping mechanisms to figure out why I was so upset. And when I came to understand that these things are not my fault, but it was my responsibility in regards to how I move forward after those unfortunate circumstances and situations. I couldn't control those, but I could control how I lived my life. So throughout my rehabilitative programs throughout prison, and mind you, tell you I had life without the possibility of parole. I was not someone who was on the top of the list for rehabilitative programs. I was actually on the bottom because I was a throwaway. I was someone who was never going to come back out here to society, you guys. The folks who had 2, 3, 5, and 7 years were on the top of the list for rehabilitative programs. I was on the bottom of the list. I did not have a release date. My release date said 9/9/99. Life without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years. That 10 years meant that after I passed away inside of prison, that my body would remain in prison for an additional 10 years. I was punished more severely than an adult due to my life expectancy. I took every opportunity that was provided, and I utilized it. I needed it. Because if I didn't take it, I would have remained that abused foster child. So whenever they put me in a program, I was very focused. I wanted to know more. And I was actually growing. I wasn't in special ed anymore. I was now in programs with adults. And I found education was an avenue. It was a resource. It was an opportunity. It was a space where I could grow. That wasn't what the foster care system had provided me. They were cutting me off at every opportunity due to my traumatic experiences. I was also cutting it off for myself due to my traumatic experiences. One of the things that really stuck out to me in my programs was amends. As I shared, to take another human life, whether justified or unjustified. It's really heavy. It never goes away. PTSD is real, but also PTSD, post-traumatic growth, is also very real. And that's what I had to utilize. I had to figure out how I was going to grow from my traumatic experiences. And when they taught me about amends, there was direct amends, indirect amends, and then living amends. I had wrote an apology letter. I had started to raise funds for organizations that my abuser was passionate about. But it was the living amends that really stuck. How was I going to live my life? And mind you, I'm a dying prisoner. But again, how am I going to live my life? How am I going to live a life of value, of morals? How was I going to have credibility? What was my legacy going to be? These are all the things that I started to ask myself as I started to evolve. Someone had asked me, who are you at 80? And I had thought to myself, I would probably live to about 70-something in prison. And I really couldn't answer who I was at 80. An older gentleman, he answered it for me. He said, you're kind, you're compassionate, you're empathetic. You're an advocate for foster care reform. You're a friend, you're accountable. And he started to place these things on my life. And then he asked me, is that who you are at 80? And I said, yeah. He said, well, the only way for you to actually be that person and to live up to all those things, you have to start living like that today. Because those things are huge. Those things take time, they take work, they take focus, intentionality. They take passion. It takes change. It takes a transformation to take place, for all those things to take place because of all these negative things that was placed on your life. I understood through those programs that what I lacked as a foster child when my mother and father didn't care for me, I lacked the ability to attach to my humanity in a caring, empathetic way. So what I did, I read a ton of books. I started to embody what I had read. I digested it. And then I just put one foot in front of the other and said, this is how I'm going to live my life. This is who I'm going to transform myself into. I then went to the warden and I asked, is it possible for me to run this program for individuals, guys who had experienced sexual abuse, guys who had experienced trauma? She said, yeah. I put a list on the wall, and I didn't know if anyone was going to sign up for the program. I was a non-affiliate. I was someone who was not a part of a gang in prison. To this day, I don't have a tattoo on my body. And when I came back and I saw that there was 900 people who had signed up for this program, so that told me it was going to take me years to actually facilitate this program, and that's what I did. I facilitated that program for almost 7 years, and it's still running today in Lancaster State Prison. The administration has taken the program over because of how successful it was and still is today. They found out that it was really successful when guys who had committed homicides and rapes and who had harmed children were now able to go to the parole board and express and explain how they became the type of people to commit those acts, but also how a transformation has taken place and what they've replaced those negative characteristics and causative factors with. Not long after facilitating these programs, and I say not long after, I'm speaking in years, but to me, I was going to be there for the rest of my life, so 7 years is really, to me, not long after. But not long after, the warden comes to my door and she's like, hey, John Legend is actually curious. He's curious about our country's mass incarceration issue. He wants to know why we are the most incarcerated country in the world. So John Legend and his team went on a prison tour, a proximity tour, where he wanted to get closer, not to the administration, but he wanted to get closer to the people. He also had experiences with our criminal legal system. He also had folks who were incarcerated. So he was very much so aware. He was very much so proximate to mass incarceration, but he didn't have enough information. So he used his platform. He used his insight. He used his ability to get closer. He wanted to come into Lancaster State Prison. And the warden asked me to present, as I present today. And I shared a 15-minute presentation on my life, my background, my transformation, my rehabilitation, and my journey in regards to how I was going to continue to be who I was, even with a life without the possibility of parole sentence. We started a brotherhood, we started a friendship, and I continued to do the work. Mr. John Legend continued to make music, he continued to advocate, and then Bryan Stevenson came into place. Not sure if you guys have seen the movie Just Mercy, but if you haven't, you should. It's important. Bryan Stevenson argued in front of the United States Supreme Court, Miller v. Alabama, and it said that our country would no longer kill kids by way of incarceration. I'm one of the recipients of Mr. Bryan Stevenson's work. I'm one of the 2,500 children that were given a death sentence in this country. When this piece of legislation was passed, it opened up the door for Loyola Marymount and for professors at USC, Professor Heidi Rummel, to actually put some real interest and some real action behind my case, behind the circumstances. They begin to make the case of mitigating factors. They begin to show that children are different from adults. Our brains are not developed. We still have room for growth, and we have the highest ability to change because of our immaturity and because of our ability to grow. When you're that young, no one can say who you're going to be when you're 40, when you're 50, when you're only 14, 15, 16 years old. A lot of you guys have no clue just yet of who you're going to be, and that's okay. Well, the same thing takes place in our criminal legal system when you're dealing with children, even after we commit the worst acts of our life. We all are more than our worst act. I took my transformation, I took my change and my rehabilitation, and I started to file for a resentencing hearing. Unfortunately, as you guys see, I'm black. And I say unfortunately because in the criminal legal system, being black, it's unfair. If I were white, or if I were anything other than black, I do not believe that I would have been punished as severely. That's why I say unfortunately. I began to file for a resentencing hearing, and again, I was black. I'm 6'6". My victim was white. He was older. I had all the marks that were unfavorable for a person like me. Thankfully enough, I had a college. I had Loyola Marymount College represent me, the Juvenile Innocence and Fair Sentencing Clinic. I had over 22 different attorneys. After 8 years of trying to get a resentencing hearing, one of my attorneys, Marissa Sachs, she said, "Let's go to the judge's boss." I was like, "Well, who is that?" Right? Who's the judge's boss? Like, the judge is the boss. She said, "No, let's go to the governor." That's exactly what we did. They filed the very first commutation application for this clinic. And I was granted. Governor Jerry Brown was going to commute 30 people. At the time, I was not on the list. My legal team contacted Mr. John Legend, said Jarrett Harper's case is now going before the governor, and we're asking for your support. Mr. John Legend and Mrs. Ty Sterclorius, who's John Legend's longtime manager still to this day, decided to get behind me, decided to get behind justice. And they wrote a 2-page letter and submitted it to the governor and said, "Not only do we support Jarrett, but please release him to us. And we will use our platform, we will use our resources, and we will help him, help the children in this country who are going through unimaginable experiences of trauma." And that's exactly what happened. I was added to the list. I became number 31, and I came home after a 5-hour long parole hearing. It wasn't a get out of jail free card just to get commuted. I still had to show that I was safe. It wasn't a justifiable homicide. Again, I had a lot of emotional issues. I had a lot of things that had taken place. And I believed at the time that revenge was the solution. That's why I keep going back into rehabilitation and therapy and transformation. Because sometimes the trauma becomes the justifiable reason as to why people commit harm. And it's so hard to get out of that, fog. Thankfully enough, I was able to get out of that fog. And I was able to develop self-love in response to the self-hate that had taken place.